We live in a culture that says keep moving. Like there isn't really room for stopping, for pressing pause, for sitting in the in-between spaces. We love change, but we don't like transitions. We don't like that ending because if we talk about transitions in terms of cycles, an ending, we want to avoid the ending. We don't want to pay attention to it because endings are hard. They're painful. It might mean we cry. It might mean we deal with emotions that we just want to stuff or skip over. And then we have to sit in the middle, that in-between time, which can be a really fallow time.
Welcome to the Reintegrate podcast. My name is Bob Robinson and my co-host is Brendan Romigh. Are you a recent college graduate or an upperclassman in college or have a loved one in that stage of life? It is an anxious time of life, transitioning out of college. New careers, new places to live, new relationships, a lot is changing. How can we best be prepared for not only our first career, but for a whole life of faithfulness in a complex world? Today's guest has lots of practical wisdom and tools to help with the transition. Erica Young Reitz is the principal and founder of an organization called After College Transition. I've known her for years, and I can't tell you how impressed I am with her expertise in and compassion for those making the transition out of college. She has several years of college ministry experience working for the CCO and directing a program at Penn State University called Senior Exit, which prepares students for life after college. Eric is the author of the very best resource on this topic, a book titled After College, Navigating Transitions, Relationships, and Faith, published by InterVarsity Press. And you can find articles by her in Christianity Today, Relevant Magazine, the Gospel Coalition, and Collegiate Collective. Erica also serves as a lecturer in English at Penn State University in their program in Writing and Rhetoric, and as an adjunct faculty member for Geneva College's Master's in Higher Education program. She lives in State College, Pennsylvania, with her husband and 2 children. Here's our interview with Erica Young Reitz. Hi, Erica. I'm glad you're with us here on this episode of the Reintegrate podcast.
Hey, Bob. Thanks so much for having me. Thrilled to be here.
It's great to have you on the show, Erica.
Thanks, Brendan. Great to meet you.
So how did you get interested in helping young people transition from college to career?
So, Bob, for those who have read After College, you know that my story, my transition story out of college was not the prettiest. I had a rough transition out of college. And despite having, a good head on my shoulders, a strong, supportive family, I had a great college experience. That transition hit me in ways I just wasn't prepared to consider. And then as I got into college ministry work later in my career, I noticed that this wasn't a unique thing to my experience. This is something that people have been observing in young people for some time. And I think, along the lines of the career counselor, Mark Savickas, who says we seek to actively master what we've passively suffered. I know that played out in my own life. So my own story, and then coupled with seeing this trend even in college ministry, saying this is a great place to step in.
So in your experience, what are the main concerns for recent college grads?
So if you're listening today and you are a recent college grad, or maybe you're about to cross the threshold there into the quote unquote real world, or if you work with college grads, you probably agree with me that transition is multifaceted, that it's easy to reduce it to a few, key items, a checklist, if you will, for graduating, resume polish check, or job offer in hand check, or I have an apartment set up, I know where I'm going to live check. But really, it's so much bigger than that. And we almost get ourselves into trouble if we try to reduce it to just a few key items, as important as those items are. I think that when we graduate from college, there's a transition on so many different fronts. We go from the status of student to, even if we go on to grad school, it's still a very different role as a student. To this, our status changes, our opportunities for friendship and fun change, our financial status often changes. We're faced with the challenge of maybe being in a place where we have to build and make community for the first time. You can't just walk across the quad and find people who are in the same life stage, going through the same joys and struggles. So much shifts at once. And I think that's part of why the transition out of college can be extremely overwhelming. And I would argue is even more difficult than the transition into college, especially because that role of student is often changing.
The solution is to just never stop being a student, right? You just go straight to grad school.
Brilliant, Brendan. Yes. Yeah, especially in a recession. Why not? Like, just go on to grad school, especially if you can't find a job. That's a great choice. If anyone's just wondering, what should I do next? Just send in a grad school application. But to your point, Brendan, I know some of us who loved the college years, we do end up going into academia or into college ministry. And I think to pay attention, if you did love college, that maybe there is a future in higher ed for you or in working with college students in college ministry. So pay attention to that if you did love the college years and being in that environment.
Well, people don't want to go through change, and maybe the perpetual student is the way to keep that from happening. But because most of us, just change is hard. It's just difficult. It's uncomfortable. Transitions are just tough. And so what can you tell us about faithfully allowing God to work in and through this transition period?
Yes, Bob, I wholeheartedly agree. Transitions are tough. And I'm one of those people that just struggles to transition, period. Like, I don't like the transition even from Sunday to Monday. I get a little angsty, like Monday's starting. I transition from like this end of the semester to this moment right now when, we've wrapped up the semester. I know I feel like a little dip in my spirit of, what's going on? And then I have to remind myself, oh, we're in a transition here. We're going from, things clicking along in the semester, and then I have to say goodbye to all my students. And there's a sadness there. There's an ending. So I think what can be really helpful is the distinguishing change from transition. One theorist, William Bridges, talks about how change is the thing happening for everybody. This thing that's going on for all of our recent grads. They're crossing the commencement stage. They're entering life after college. This external thing happening. But transition, it's what's going on inside, the things that you're processing internally. And these things are not always directly proportional, right? Like the change that triggered the transition, the change may be the same for everyone, but the way we process that change is going to be different for each person. And so I want to encourage anyone going through a transitional moment right now, because life is full of transitions, whether that's the transition out of college or the transition into a job or transitioning from wearing a mask to not wearing a mask or whatever we go through all these transitions right now, every day. And they can be challenging. And so I just want to encourage us that God has unique things in store. Back to your question, Bob, of, how does God meet us in transitions? I think when we're willing to look vertically at, God, what are you doing? And then look internally at what he's saying to us, rather than scanning the horizon and comparing ourselves to every other person going through a similar transition, we can really learn things.
It's just so hard to live in the present. I'm one who just is constantly, okay, what's next? What's next? What's next? And I do not sit well in the change or the transition. You have any pointers for me or anybody who is so quick to try to move on?
Bob, thanks for sharing that. And I think many people on this call could agree with, we live in a culture that says keep moving. Like, there isn't really room for stalling, for stopping, for pressing pause, for sitting in the in-between spaces. We love change, but we don't like transitions. We don't like that ending, because if we talk about transitions in terms of cycles, an ending, we want to avoid the ending. We don't want to pay attention to it because endings are hard. They're painful. It might mean we cry. It might mean we deal with emotions that we just want to stuff or skip over. And then we have to sit in the middle, that in-between time, which can be a really fallow time. And I know from going through my own transitions, I just wanted to fast forward that in-between time. The transitions experience can take anywhere from 3 months to 3 years, according to Coach Terry Walling. And we want to give ourselves the space to be in those transitions. So if you're like Bob, if you're like the rest of us who want to fast forward or avoid it, some of us are more past oriented and we struggle to move on. We struggle to process the emotions around it. I think one thing we need to do is create frames in our lives that allow us space to reflect. Making space, even if for you, if it starts with 10 minutes, I'm going to start journaling for 10 minutes about what just happened. What did I just go through? What was this college experience in a time of COVID? Start to process those things and find people who can ask you good questions about the things you're going through. But if we just keep fast forward, this stuff is going to rear its head somewhere else in our future and steal from our future if we don't process it now.
Talking graduates of college, I mean, this is a generation that is the distracted generation. We did a Jubilee conference for CCO that was virtually done. And instead of having yet another virtual session, we had a silent retreat section of the thing. And we all brought our phones and we piled them up high underneath the cross in the church we were meeting. And I said, you can't be distracted. This is going to be time for you and God.
Yeah, that's so good, Bob. I think we need those spaces. I love that you did that silent retreat. We need those moments just away from our phones. And, if you're listening to this and that is not something you're used to, even just 15 minutes away from your phone where you don't check it, and then you can move to an hour away from your phone. I think even learning to be with our devices and not needing anything from them. I think we're just so, that text or that little dopamine hit that we're looking for, how can we put that aside so that we can get into those postures of reflecting and thinking about our experiences? Because we need to make room for those things, even those of us who are highly distracted. I know that I remember an article by Sherry Turkle where it talked about college students would rather receive mild electric shocks than sit in silence. And so if you're listening and that's you, you're not alone. You're a part of a generation that struggles to pause and be still. But this is not something for mystics and poets and, just contemplatives. This is something for the everyday disciple. We need to pause and reflect and sit in the silence. Try 5 minutes in silence.
Well, we talk a lot about calling. Reintegrate is about helping people find their callings. And that word calling, if there's a calling, there's a caller. And we cannot be attentive to callings if we're not listening. And if we're not taking time to be quiet to listen, then we're trying to navigate our callings in our own strength, in our own journey, in our own direction, and God is not a part of it. What are we doing instead of teaching a bunch of stuff to people? What are we doing just to help them listen?
Beautiful, Bob. Beautiful. Yeah, we could just stop right now on that note of how are we raising up people to be listeners? And I think that is a lost art, listening, learning how to listen to one another well. And anytime we can do that, we're only practicing how to listen to God and listen to the messages of our culture and sort all these things out, because there's a lot of noise right now. There's a lot of things coming at us, and we have to train up ourselves and others to be thoughtful listeners of our social feeds, of the things happening around us, and of the things that people are saying to us. Good listeners in conversation with others. And then how do we listen to the one who is calling us into our next steps? Yeah.
So, Erica, I am probably, compared to a lot of college students, uniquely blessed. And that the place I grew up and the place I went to college and the place that I live now are all the same place, which is, again, a great way to avoid transitions. That being said, even I was aware, as I was preparing to transition away from college my senior year, that I was going to need to find a new community. I was going to need to find new friends. I was going to need to find a new body of believers. For most of college, the campus ministry was my church family because I did not have a consistent church home at that time. A lot of college students transitioning out are going to have it a lot worse than I did. They're going to be moving to a new city. They're not going to know anyone. So for those people, what practical tips do you have for finding community?
Brendan, thanks for sharing your story and for bringing up a topic that is probably the number one question I get from those who want to help students as well as students who are in transition. How do we find community? Especially when we go from, not everyone has the same college experience, but there is something about the incubator of college that just the optimal conditions for building and making community if you're looking for that as a college student. And post-college, I have alums who would say, like, I just was not prepared for the patience and intentionality it takes to make friends after college. And I think first to name that for anyone listening, that if it feels slow right now, if you're trying to build and make that community and it feels slow, that's really normal. If you think about the college experience, there's just so many things that make up the college experience that accelerate intimacy. And post-college, it happens at a slower pace. You may in college go on a road trip with folks or spend, do those retreats that Bob talked about earlier. And those things accelerate intimacy in a way that may not yet exist in the post-college reality. You may be just trying to get to know folks at a Wednesday night midweek Bible study. And, for the most part, you're trying to wait till the actual study is over so you can talk to people afterwards, because those are the moments where you start to get to know people. And these moments may only happen once a week or every other week. And so just the rhythm of finding that. As far as like practical help, we're always asking, what's next? What's next? What's next? And I think a better question is, where's next? And really helping students think through a theology of place. Like, where do you want to build your adult life? Meg Jay, author of Defining Decade, says the adult life is made up of, person, place, and thing. And I think so often we focus on the thing, like what am I going to do for paid work in the world? And we miss really big questions of theology of place. Like, where do I want to build my adult life? Meg Jay would say, start with whichever one of these you know something about. Start, if you know where you want to, build your job, or if you know you have this significant relationship and you want to move near that person. But sometimes we have no clue about all three of those things. And if we have no clue about all three of those things, I think starting with the where versus the what is a better place to start, and think about, can I move for a community or can I stay? I mean, Brendan, even you staying in the area of your alma mater, that may be faithfulness. And so I just think helping people think through before making this move all the way across the country, are there gospel-centered, Bible-believing churches that I can connect to? Where is God at work? Using the Blackaby language of like, where is God at work, and where can I join him in this next step? And, certainly there's going to be times where we take a job and then we, start looking for community once we take that job. And so for those who are in that position, continuing to put yourself out there and knowing that you may be the person who has to introduce yourself to people at church. People aren't going to maybe come finding you, or you may have to get out of the rhythm or the rut of your typical week, even though you're exhausted and you'd much rather binge watch that Netflix show. Like, get out there and initiate, because they're not coming for you. So being willing to get out of our comfort zone.
The being willing to get out of your comfort zone. That's something that I think for me, was something that I was probably uniquely aware of for being a college student, because I went to a commuter campus where student involvement, as a rule, is much lower than it would be,
sure,
on a residential campus. So I really had to go out of my way and find community. It's not like I was just hanging out in the dorms. I had to stay on campus after class, and I had to meet this awkward bald campus minister named Bob, and I had to put myself out there, So for me, when I graduated, at very least I had some awareness that, I'm going to have to put myself out there again. I guess I would offer encouragement to anyone listening that patience with that really is key. If there's one thing I did learn, is that, young adults and young Christian adults everywhere are yearning for that community. They might be harder to find in some places than others, but I think that is a universal thing.
Yeah. Oh, Brendan, so good.
As many of my listeners know, I have 3 adult children. One is living with me during an internship. One is living on campus. One is out in the workplace. What advice do you have for me, parents of young adults, and for those who are young adults themselves? How can we transition into healthy relationships?
Bob, that's like a really big question. We could talk about that all night.
Okay.
I think what's interesting is that there are more young people living under their parents' roof than have been since the end of the Great Depression. That there was a Pew Research study done, I think last July, talking about the uptick of people living with their parents. And it wasn't just dependents who are moving home because they were thrust home due to stay-at-home orders and college campuses closing doors and going remote. This is more people than ever before, since the end of the Great Depression, are living with their families. And as I'm listening to students and recent grads and things that are coming up in family relationships, I think, and we can also look at studies that have been done on mental health and young people and family relationships. So I think what's happening is challenges that were there before are only being magnified and coming to the surface. And so when you're in a tight space with people and challenging family relationships, that is only coming to the fore. And so I want to encourage everybody listening today that this can be a great opportunity to ask, what relationship do I have and what vision do I have for what it could be? And if you don't have a vision for what it could be, that's another beautiful moment to step in and to be praying about and listening for what God's vision is for that relationship. And I'm someone who believes that if you were raised by humans, then there's something that's going to be broken in that relationship. There's things that do need to be worked on. I have a friend who was like, I'm not saving for my kids' college education. I'm saving for their future counseling sessions. And, my husband and I talk about that too. Like, we know we're going to screw our kids up in some way that they're going to have to, undo. And I think the decade of the 20s is a great time to borrow from a Jewish psychologist, to forgive your parents and heal yourself. Like, these are great moments to do that. And so I've talked about the challenges that have come up in a time of COVID with family relationships, but I've also heard beautiful stories of students really grateful for these stretches with their families, and relationships that have been fostered and built. This one student talked about building a patio with his parents, like over the last summer. And like that became a metaphor for just rebuilding his relationship with his parents. And so I think, as so many people are in with family relationships right now, really close quarters because of COVID, this does create an opportunity to ask those questions. What's going well? What do we want to build on? What could be different, and how could we work towards that? And I think the ultimate goal is a relationship where mutually respected adults are, in a healthy, interdependent relationship.
Healthy adults. So I'm not going to say the line, as long as you're living under my roof, you'll abide by my rules. I shouldn't be saying
Well,
that.
I mean, Bob, it depends on like what you're trying to achieve with your children. We always talk about what's the goal, and but I think you do point out something, that they are living under your roof, and so I think it's okay to acknowledge that parents may have some expectations, and maybe they do pay rent, maybe they do pick up one part of the grocery bill, or like, I think that it's perfectly okay to say they are under your roof, and maybe there are some things that are expectations. I know right after college, I moved back home with my parents, just because hopefully your listeners aren't in this camp, but I was someone who had zero like post-graduation plan. I just did not make a post-graduation plan for myself. As friends were applying to jobs and things senior year, I was busy just enjoying senior year. And I had applied to a grand total of 0 jobs my senior year. I had some like bohemian idea that I would move to New York City and become a writer, but I don't know how I thought that was like reality was going to happen for me, because I had done nothing proactive to secure that future for myself. So I moved home, and I was home with my parents for probably 3 days. And I was like, I can't live here. I love my parents. Like we had a great relationship, but after the autonomy of college, going under their roof was really hard for me. And it was little things. It was just like my dad asking me like, what are you up to today? What are you doing today? When are you going to be back? And I wasn't used to answering to anybody for those questions. And so, but I came to realize like, that wasn't my dad trying to get in my business. He was just trying to, make conversation, and it was respectful if I could share those things with him, because I was under his roof. So I think that that's okay to set some of those things, and it doesn't have to be an all out like what are the ground rules, but just communication around it, because everyone goes into it with expectations.
I appreciate your insight on your experience, because I think mine was the opposite, because I did live at home for all 4 years. I mean, financially, I needed to stay at home and go to school. And that meant I had to figure things out with my parents and I had to do it pretty quickly. Right. And I think a lot of the arguments and disagreements that some students have when they're 22 or 23 coming home, I had those at like 19 and 18.
That's right.
And, but it's funny because I would offer encouragement to anyone even now who faces that task coming home as a 22-year-old or whatever. It's going to take time. I have a pretty healthy relationship with my parents. I still live at home, and not a great time to buy a house. That's my excuse right now. But
it's not a great time to buy a house.
But that being said, even though I have what I feel like is a fairly, is a peaceful, generally respectful relationship with my parents, there's still regularly things that come up that we need to work through. There's still from time to time things flare up, and it's like, oh crap, like we just need to sit down and talk this through. We know we all love each other. We know we all want what's best for each other, and misunderstanding is the mother of conflict sometimes.
Well said, Brendan. That's right. And I love how you point out it's not like once and done, right? Like you're gonna have a conversation, and then something's gonna flare up at some point. And then I love that you guys have a relationship where you can sit down and say, hey, this is what's going on. How can we make this go better? That's a beautiful thing, Brendan.
So here's a crazy statistic. 3/4 of all college grads do not end up working in a career related to their majors. I was a communications major, and my first job that I had for a little under 2 years was in construction management. So I am very much an example of that statistic. Now I'm in a stage personally where I'm trying to figure out my next step. And it certainly seems for me like sometimes my options are too many, especially with my degree and with what my degree allows me to do. You have a chapter in your book titled The Tyranny of Choice. And I can certainly relate to this phrase, especially in this stage of my life. And I'm sure others feel it too, whether they're fresh out of college or whether they're in a similar situation to me. The two big questions are, how do I know what God's will is for my career? Which is something I find myself asking every day. And what is the best route to make wise decisions?
Brendan, great question. And also, I think an encouragement to many people on this phone call that if you're someone who trained for something specific and you're like, what am I going to do with this? Or I'm not doing what I trained for, that you're not alone. In fact, I would encourage, go talk to people who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and find out about their career journey, because I can guarantee it is not linear. Life is often not linear. Learning from others who have gone before us to see, wow, there's so many different dots in your life, and God has connected those in a beautiful way. But I bet that person could have never predicted, and certainly there are going to be individuals who train for something really specific and go on and do that thing. But I think so many of us are, at many different junctures asking. In fact, full disclosure, I was just on a phone call the other night with friends where I'm like, is there going to be a moment where I stop questioning my paid output in the world? Like this idea of, will I ever find this place of complete settled in my career journey? Because I've had quite a career journey. I did work for the CCO for 14 years, but in those last years and questioning my callings, I love that you use the S on the end of callings, because we're called to so many different things. There's many turns where, I'm 41 and I'm questioning, what's my next career move? And I think that's really normal. I do want to encourage those listening. And then, Brendan, to your question of like, how do we discern? Probably a pattern that I see the most is, students who feel like there's, maybe this option and this option, like A or B, and one is success, one is failure. And if I don't listen to God hard enough, and if I don't pick the right one, I'm going to be like cast into permanent plan B. And then I'm like not going to meet the person I'm supposed to marry. And I'm not going to I'm always going to be on permanent plan B. And so I just want to encourage us to like not pit these good choices against one another. And that there's often times where God just lets us choose and say, okay, I'm going to bless that. And, it sounds like, Brendan, you're someone who could be interested in a number of things and probably good at a number of things. And so I think it's just continuing to be spending time with the caller. Sometimes we have this big decision and then we're like, oh, I better get praying about this. But really, when we are cultivating that daily relationship with God, then we have more of a sense of where those next steps are when that big decision comes. Like, I don't think we just turn it on when the big decision comes. Like, we want to be cultivating that relationship daily. And, even though we want that, right? Like, I want that email from God that just says, Erica, this is what you should do. Or I want that, that skywriting that just says, oh yeah, okay, I'll do that. Because I desperately want to be faithful. But I think we sometimes overcomplicate it and wring our hands when God's saying, take a next step. I'm going to bless it.
Worry about the permanent plan B, it kind of limits the fact that God is sovereign over all of our decisions, and he can turn all things to the good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. So we can rest in that.
Bob can attest that, back when I was 22, I had a very bad case of Plan B syndrome, where I was so terrified of making the wrong choice. And I did have so many options. I remember the plethora of jobs I was applying for, and I was like, oh my gosh, I could do this, I could do that, just in the field of commercial work, not even taking into account that I was also considering nonprofit work, and I was also considering ministry work, and I was also considering going to grad school. I ended up in construction. I actually got callbacks on multiple jobs, but that was the one that made sense to me at the time. It made sense financially. And frankly, it was the job where I felt like I would be the least bored. My point though, and I guess what I would hope, the listeners would take away is that I don't feel like any part of the last 2 years was wasted.
Brendan, I love that. And one of the things I love that you shared about how you discerned the job is you said it just made sense. Like, it made sense financially. And the faculty of our brain is something that God has given us in the decision-making process. And sometimes we, I don't know, for lack of a better word, we can over spiritualize, or we can overthink things, when sometimes it does come down to faithfulness. I need to pay bills. And so this job makes sense right now. And I think that's really okay to filter this through a lens of logic and mental faculty that would say, this makes sense. And it may not make sense for the next stretch, Brendan. And I love that you're asking that. So part of that Zoom call with my friends, I'm saying is there going to be a point where I stop asking this question? And, one friend was like, I think every day we wake up and should be asking the Lord, what is my output in the world today? That's a good question to be asking often. And so, there's going to be seasons where we do feel like we're asking more questions than we're getting answers. And I do want to encourage those who may be in a similar place to you, Brendan, right now, who are, what should I do? And maybe people who feel like, I don't even know what one option is going to be. You seem like you have several different options. There may be people who feel like, I don't even have one option right now. I was just talking to a woman at Penn State who is the director of the Career Enrichment Network folks in the Liberal Arts College, who are looking for what's my next step. And she's been they do these surveys every year of postgrads and to learn about what are your next steps or what job did you take in this path. And what they're learning right now, this very moment with this survey, is that many people are not taking any steps. They're kind of believing the narrative like there's no jobs out there, there's no internships out there. And so that narrative is paralyzing people in their prospects and in their process. And so I do want to encourage folks, if you're believing that right now and you're just feeling stalled, to take a step. It may mean adapting. It may mean I was trained in this lane, but I'm going to go in this lane. But to not say no for yourself right now. And if that thing isn't happening, how can you use this time right now to cultivate a new skill? So part of what Susan is saying is that if you want to, separate yourself from somebody who's applying to grad school or applying for a job, their employers are going to be asking, what did you do in the lull? Like, what did you do, between, and
Right.
if you learned a new language or you learned how to code, like those are all things that could set you apart. And so for those who may feel like I don't have an option right now and I'm not sure what's next, how can we, to borrow from Andy Crouch, how can we create more than we consume right now, even in a job search?
Excellent advice there, Erica. Thanks for coming on. We really appreciate your time with us. I'm looking forward to college students graduating, but I've got a couple that are going into their senior year, and I'm hoping they'll listen to this as well, because preparing for that senior transition is just as important, isn't it?
That's right, Bob. Absolutely. Early on and often, I think preparing for the transition out of college, the best thing you can do is to start having the conversations now so that you're prepared on the other end. And if you're on the other end or supporting someone on the other end, I would love to continue to connect with you about good resources. Find me at aftercollegetransition.com, and I'm happy to help you get good resources in your hands.
Erica, it was great having you on the show. Thank you.
Brendan, thanks so much for having me. It was a blast to hang out with you guys. Thanks for the good work that you're doing, and blessings on your transition and all of those who are in transition right now.
Hey, thanks for listening. Reintegrate is my ministry to college students, marketplace leaders, and church leaders, helping Christians to reintegrate their faith with every aspect of life, especially their callings. For the latest articles on reintegrating your callings with God's mission, online resources for further learning, and how to get copies of the small group Bible study resource, a book I authored titled Reintegrate Your Vocation with God's Mission, go to the Reintegrate webpage. That's re-integrate.org. Remember the dash. You can also find the Reintegrate podcast page with other episodes and ways to email us to comment on this podcast. That's re-integrate.org.